Greetings, greetings, greetings. Thank you very much for joining us here at VAfrica. The name is Pongo, aka the Honorable Metaphor. But today is not about me, it's about the wonderful, the amazing life of Charles Anglin. Charles, thank you very much for joining us.
Well, thank you very much for inviting me, though I'm quite keen to know why you're called the Honourable Metaphor, but we'll come on to that maybe later. No, it's my pleasure. Thank you for inviting me.
I'll definitely tell you about that after this. So Charles, we've talked before this. You say you come from London. You have Jamaican roots. What brings you to Africa?
What brings me to Africa? Well, actually, do you know what? So I should explain a little bit more about myself. So I'm Jamaican by heritage. As you can hear from the accent, I am British by birth, and I am Sierra Leonean by choice. A series of choices which has seen me go across Africa and really begin to settle here and really feel at home at Sierra Leone. But what brings me to Africa? When you grow up black in a predominantly, overwhelmingly white country, it's 95% white in the UK, you are inevitably incredibly conscious of your skin colour, of your culture, that it's different from almost everyone surrounding you. And I've always been fascinated by that difference from its surrounding, but also fascinated to understand where my culture actually came from. And when I was probably about 10 or 11, there was an amazing TV program in Africa, which, you know, came on every week, and it was like 20 episodes long. And funnily enough, it was this slightly crazy white man who had been like he was kind of a liberation historian, had been the only white man to go to the like the independence conference of Mozambique or something. I mean, it was really quite a hardcore. But he did this amazing history, and I thought, why has no one ever told me about this? And I thought, you know, that's where I'm going to live one day. It was about 30 years later before I actually got to come to Africa. And then I've been coming ever since. And for the last decade or so, Africa has been my workplace, essentially, and where I live.
Okay, Africa is everyone's home. What are the things that you've experienced? Some of the things that you've experienced in Africa?
Well, I mean, Africa is so extraordinarily diverse. So, I mean, I've travelled through quite a few countries, you know. As I said, Sierra Leone is the place I think I feel most comfortable, not least because the language, particularly Creole, and the culture is so similar to Jamaican culture, because so much of the Creole culture came from freed Jamaican slaves. So there's a very close proximity there to my culture, but also the difference. Probably the most different place I ever went to was Juba, the capital of South Sudan, which is the only city I've ever been at night where there are no lights. There was not one single, not even a generator powering, which was a different experience. Then I realised, okay, I have Western privilege. Yeah, that's when that dawned on me. Okay, this is the reality. Another extraordinary experience. I was again privileged enough to go on a safari, and you know, we had one of these tents, and I opened the tent door one day, and about 2 yards away there was a crocodile sitting there looking at me, and I thought, this is not a London experience. As I slowly inched away, I came back 3 hours later. It was still there, so I was slightly alarmed. But no, I mean Africa. Africa has given me lots and lots of experiences. For about a decade or so, up until the last 2 or 3 years, I used to run election campaigns, and I had what for a simple South London boy from a very working class South London background was an extraordinary experience, sitting next to the newly elected president of Kenya and being the first person to turn to him and say, "Congratulations, Mr. President." That was quite something, I have to say. That was an experience I don't expect to repeat again in my life.
Yeah, like I said, the interesting life of Charles. I can probably say you were almost eaten by a crocodile.
Certainly felt like that to me.
You were almost eaten by a crocodile. You've run election campaigns. You said earlier something about Brain Sierra Leone changing narratives.
Yeah. So now I'm for the last 2 or 3 years I've been doing various. The last election campaign that I did, I should say, was helping His Excellency Julius Maada Bio get elected as president of Sierra Leone, and he did me the honour of asking me to help with a few roles and tasks in government. And the latest is that he's just asked me to help set up a new program called Brown Sierra Leone. And Brown Sierra Leone is an effort to transform Sierra Leone's image internationally. Most people in the world have never heard of Sierra Leone. And if they have, what they've heard is negative. They've heard of Ebola, they've heard of the Civil War, blood diamond, child soldiers, that sort of thing. But there's a wonderful, exciting, beautiful Sierra Leone that no one really ever talks about. And my role will be to help tell the story of that Sierra Leone, the real Sierra Leone. And so that's a very exciting task, which I'm looking forward to taking up.
The interesting life of Charles, ladies and gentlemen. So can I take you back in history? Since African countries started, let's just say since Kwame Nkrumah, what have you seen changing for the better or for the worst in Africa?
Well, it's interesting. I mean, in Nkrumah, there's a very famous speech that Nkrumah gave in which he was demanding independence, and he said, so after they must give us independence so that we can demonstrate that after all the African knows how to run his own affairs. And for decades, I remember reading a book, which is a really, really fascinating book talking about the historical struggle for independence. And it's a book that I eventually had to put down in really kind of disgust and anger, because at the end of it, it was just this story of despair saying Africa was always going to be trapped in chaos and war. And I just thought, this is not true. Now, this is about 20 years ago that I read that book. In the intervening 20 years, which is again maybe 30 or 30 years since after Nkrumah, the global story of Africa has started to change. People talk about the African Renaissance. And in that time, the average income in Africa has tripled. The size of the African middle class, i.e. the people with spare income, has tripled. And Africa has shifted from just being a place where people in the West want to take resources so they can turn them into products to sell elsewhere, to a place they want to sell products to. And that's massively important for changing the way Africa's economy operates and for giving much more opportunity to people across Africa. Now, it's true that that's probably only made a huge difference in about half a dozen to a dozen of Africa's 54 countries. But it's a significant change. It's a turning of the corner. And so, whereas when Nkrumah made that speech, I think way back in 1956 or 57, he had a huge sense of optimism. And by the late 60s, that optimism seemed to have largely disappeared. Again, we can have that same optimism. This is Africa's century, and it's our job, our opportunity, and our duty to make this Africa's century.
Yeah, that's true. The rise of Africa. What do you think about the future of Africa if you look at today's youth in the terms of what today's youth are doing in the terms of the schooling systems that are there in Africa? Where do you see Africa in the next 10, 20, 30 years?
I think Africa has transformed, actually. You talk about youth and education. In the last 20 years, we've seen a massive shift back towards free education. In the 1960s, African governments post-independence embraced free education. By the 1990s, as the money started to run out, the Western banking system, the IMF, forced huge budget cuts, and one of the things that they crazily cut was free education. And then in countries like Sierra Leone, an 11-year civil war saw the education system destroyed. And one of the fantastic things that President Bio has done was to double the amount the government spends on education and to abolish all education, all school fees, which is an amazingly empowering act. Now, what that does is obviously what education is a kind of like a foundation stone to giving people the ability to dream, to act on their dreams, to see their lives in a different way and to change their lives. But it also makes them, gives them ability to get new jobs and to be economically active in a way that they're not. And it's the economy that's going to drive change in Africa. And what I think is going to happen over the next 30 so years is that we're going to shift from when the West has spoken traditionally about Africa's economy, it's been about mining and oil and energy sector and the energy sector. That's going to shift. It's going to shift to agriculture, and I tell you why. Because the global population is going to reach 10 billion by 2050. That's probably going to double the price of food globally. That means that the biggest and most valuable commodity over the next 3 decades is going to be farmland and food, growing that food. 60% of the world's available farmland is in Africa. So African land and farmland needs to be invested in, needs to be feeding the world, but feeding Africa. Because a big part of that increase in global food demand is not in the West, it's in Africa. But it's in that middle class, growing middle class in Africa as well. So that's going to change the economy. And because so many people, 80% of people in Africa are dependent on farming in one way or the other, when you change and you modernize the farming sector, that will liberate people and that will change their lives. So that change is coming. And we just need to make sure that when that investment comes, it doesn't end up as it did with the mining sector, with foreign companies coming in, grabbing control of it, and ordinary people missing out. It needs to ensure that ordinary farmers actually get a chance to be successful suppliers and to feed themselves and their neighbours and their families and the rest of the world.
Oh, that's beautiful. So you heard that, grab an axe, grab a hoe, go and dig, go and farm. Yeah, one last thing, last but not least, the internet brought about a global village. to what extent has the internet changed the African narrative? Probably, I would guess you were born during the time where there was
There was no internet.
Yeah,
Yeah.
So,
You
so
are in fact right.
yeah. So how has the coming of the internet changed the African story from way before there was internet?
It's allowed Africans to write their own story, and that's the biggest change. So we need to start using the internet much more positively. That's one of the things that Brand Sierra Leone will do. And one of the kind of tragedies of the kind of the use of the internet has often been how negative the discourse within Africa on the internet has been. Often with the diaspora criticising governments back home, often rightfully, but what that's done is that's overshadowed the positive story. And I think we need to start redefining the African story and focusing on our future, our opportunities, and on the amazing work that is going on, the amazing cultural work, the amazing economic work, the changes and transformations that are happening in Africa. But the internet is fantastic because it allows you to write your own story free of the traditional media. And if the story is good enough, it'll punch through.
Okay, thank you very much, Charles, for joining us. I look forward to talking to you again after the successful launch of Brand Sierra Leone. It's been a pleasure. Thank you very much, Charles.
Thank you for having me. Real pleasure.
Thank you. Thank you very much for viewing. This is Pongo. Out.